Welcome to Drink Naked. My name is Stewie Robinson from Naked Wines. On this podcast, I'll be talking with a legend, an absolute rock star from the world of wine, and hopefully getting the answers to what drives them to do exactly what they do. Along the way, you'll learn a lot about wine and the many, many exciting things about it, but especially you'll learn about how the winemaker, when free to express their creativity, can make something truly awe-inspiring and life-changing. Today on Drink Naked, we welcome the Master from Margaret River in Western Australia, Mr. Brian Fletcher. Fletch, welcome.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks for the alliteration. That was very good. Thank you.
My pleasure. I do that a lot. Let me cut straight to the chase. You are one of Margaret River's most prominent and awarded winemakers. You have a wealth of experience that spans over 40 years in both new and old world wine regions. You've been awarded more than 15 trophies, 100 gold medals. You've worked all over Australia and even for a time managed a winery in Tunisia working out of an old colonial French chateau, which we'll get to just a little bit later.
Sure.
You were the very first winemaker to get naked back in 2012 after taking a leap of faith and finally got your name on the front label of a bottle of wine. My question to you is, what took you so long to realise that personal dream?
Well, I think it's a man's got to eat sometimes, you know. So I spent a long time working as a soldier winemaker for various companies, and you reach a certain stage in your career or your life where you feel like maybe I should do this. And so it takes a bit of courage. It's not an easy industry, and I wouldn't call myself a salesman, but without naked, it would probably never have happened. So I admire anybody that does that, I suppose. I think that's the best way to look at it. Yeah.
Because if it wasn't putting your name on the front of your own wines that you're proudly making, we would never have got to meet you, and we would never have got to meet the man behind so many wines that you've made over so many years. So there is a wonderful positive to putting your name on the front of a label, is there not?
Absolutely. I was just a quiet achiever.
For how many years, was I right, saying over 40 years?
Well, at least 40 vintages. I know that. Yep. I was counting them back the other day. I started professionally in 1981. That was my really first professional job.
Yep.
And if whatever that number is, plus 5 or so overseas where I doubled up.
Yep.
That probably puts it over 40 vintages, I suppose. Because that in itself is interesting. It's like getting 100, I suppose, in cricket or something like that. But
absolutely. And you've mentioned doing 2 vintages in 1 year. So just for those who don't realise, if you do a vintage in the Northern Hemisphere, of course, you can do one in the Southern Hemisphere in the same calendar year, right?
Yeah. Well, you could do when I was younger, but these days it'd probably burn me out. But I used to do it, yeah.
Because it's hard yakka.
Yeah, it is. In the early days when I worked at Great Western, you know, the vintage would start on Australia Day normally in the Riverland and burn right through to when we pick fruit out of Drumborg, which would go into May. So it was effectively 6 months of the year that it'd go for.
It has to be one of the longest vintages in the world.
Probably, yeah. But that's the nature of Australian winemaking. You often have a winery that, you know, it's more efficient if it can take fruit from various regions to keep going, to fill it up, to use it properly, to use the asset. So I'm not sure what they do these days, but that's the way it was. Quite long, quite exciting, but tiring the other way. So we'd sort of be halfway finished vintage, and we're already producing wine and bottling it sort of during the vintage of wines we'd already made. So
it's constant, isn't it? Everyone, I think the romantic version or vision from the wine lover in the street is that once you've crushed the grapes with your bare feet, of course.
Yes, of course.
You basically take 6 months off, but that's not the case, is it?
Well, for the way I work, it's probably a little bit of the opposite. You know, I work with a viticulturist that I've worked with, Murray, for a long time. And in that role, you know, the decisions, he does a lot of the heavy lifting during the vintage, and then the wheel starts to really turn about now, really when we're packaging up for bottling and so on and so on. It really does get quite busy, and there's a fair bit of what I might call cognitive dissonance. There's so many things happening, I have to start using a bloody list, you know, a pencil and paper, and write down all the priorities sometimes. It just does get complicated. But in the end, simplicity should be the thing that should reign supreme, but sometimes you have to blend your way out of trouble quite often. actually. It's tricky stuff.
When you say you make a list of the priorities around this time of year being July in Australia, what is the main priority?
Oh, the priority is really just lining everything up for bottling because it gets intense, and it's just, it's just intense, and there are a lot of blending options, and probably what I was writing the other day on that post about blending and so on, whether you make the right thing or the wrong thing, whichever way you go. You have to make a decision and stick with it. Otherwise, you can't hold things up. You've got to get it right as best you can. I think that's the best way to put it, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'll find that I jump around a lot because I don't like these chats to be completely linear. But but can we go back a little bit? Because I noticed that you, at the very beginning of your young adult life, studied metallurgy at university.
Yes.
And I'd like to say, and clearly metallurgy led to a long career in winemaking.
Absolutely.
What the heck happened there?
What a great question. Well, I grew up in Newcastle, of course, and, went to Boys High, and you all work for BHP or whatever, become a trainee and so on and so on. But I suppose what kicked me over the edge to the dark side was my brother was a civil engineer and worked for the Cessnock Council for a while, and he used to bring home a lot of wine. I think in those days they probably used to bribe him, like bulldozer road from Murray Tyrrell up the laneway or something, and here's a couple of cases, and probably what they did. I think the currency in North Queensland at the moment is a tinny and an outboard motor for the same sort of things, they tell me. But so I just used to drink a lot of Hunter wines, a lot of Hunter Semillon, and used to go up there with my mates and so on, and I just fell into the grip of the grape, I suppose, really, in the end. And
but what was it about metallurgy that attracted you in the first place?
Nothing whatsoever. Oh, metallurgy. Well, that's what one did. I mean, that's what I.
So you fell into it simply because you're in the steel city.
Steel city, and a lot of people like working in steelworks. There's a certain attraction to seeing the fire and heat and smoke and dystopian sort of environment. It's people fell in love with it. Everybody loved working on the blast furnaces and working shift work, and you could be out at night and so on and so on. But anyway, that's what I was. But,
so this was late 70s, early 80s?
This was early 70s.
Early 70s,
yeah. And
when it would have been booming, Newcastle.
Absolutely booming, yeah. It was full on. There was no such thing as, people looking for work. Everybody had a job and so on, and things were on the fly. And that's what I did, because that was the accepted thing, All the family were all sort of technically trained. My brother was an engineer, my sister was a radiographer, my other sister was a nurse. So we all, and mum and dad dad was a butcher, mum was a cashier.
In Newcastle.
In Newcastle, and had a hard, went through the depression, all those sort of things, and that was, that was success. That was success for the family as they saw it. Education and a good job. Yeah, that's the way it was.
Did they have an education?
Mum grew up in Cooktown and was taught by the nuns up there in a convent, and her father was a stoker on the dredges, and they actually came down the coast of Australia looking for work, and he ended up in Newcastle, the family, stoking dredges in Newcastle Harbour, and obviously died of silicosis. And mum was a cashier, dad was a butcher, he managed a couple of shops around the place in Adamstown and a couple in Sydney. That's how they met. But they would have loved to have an opportunity. They were both intelligent, very intelligent, but lacked the opportunity, as it were. You're going through the depression, affected people in many ways. So their ethic was save for a rainy day. That's how it was. Store up, keep things, don't throw them away. It was such a crushing, the depression was such a crushing emotional burden. It actually changed the way people behaved, I think, post-depression, then the war and so on, Yeah.
And then you ended up in Margaret River, but we'll get there in a second.
Yeah, we'll get there.
We'll get there in a second because I get the feeling that you did a lot of vintages overseas first, didn't you? In Italy?
Well, my first stint was actually, of all things, I was sort of halfway through Charles Sturt Uni, and I got towards the end, and I, in a roundabout way, I ended up running a mobile bottling line in California.
Okay.
As you do.
As you do.
having a coffee and some Twinkies for breakfast, and driving up to various wineries. And
So a mobile bottling line literally out the back of a truck, right?
yeah. That was the early days of them. They were the antichrist of machines, those things. And I used to travel all around the Napa Valley and Sonoma and so on in it. Lived in Livermore, just right near Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, with a divorced engineer who had a gun under his pillow. It was interesting times, actually. Yeah. And yeah, right. And so I did that. Then I ended up I did a bit of work with Jacques Laton, and went to Basilicata in central southern Italy. And a few other bits and pieces. Went to Virginia, did a bit of a vintage over there. Various stuff, yeah. I didn't really hit Italy until somewhat later, actually, in the timeline.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned, actually, you didn't mention, you wrote me a little letter when I asked you for just a couple of, hints as to your background. And
sure.
And I said I wouldn't use them, and I won't.
No, it's fine.
You intimated that in your 20s, you were a little lost.
Oh, well, yeah.
What was going on there?
Oh, well, I wasn't sure about my career. It was sort of between metallurgy and winemaking. I used to do a fair bit of, I did a fair bit of jumping out of aeroplanes, skydiving for quite a while. That sort of helped calm the need for doing different things. Used to jump up out of a place called Elderslie in the Hunter Valley. Enjoyed that.
All solo jumps?
Oh, yeah. And went overseas, travelled around Europe doing it, went to America, bought a Volkswagen station wagon in Florida, drove across the States, jumping in various places with a mate. And the thing was, again, I used the Antichrist. There was the twin carburettor Volkswagen station wagon, which was unbelievable. That gave us so much trouble. Anyway, we got...
I thought you were about to say unbelievably good.
No. We bought this thing, and it had the sign up, the second most southern car yard in continental US. So it was $800 for a Plymouth Barracuda, or the Volkswagen station wagon. So we bought the station wagon and had enough rust in it you could punch a hole through, and drove it all the way across to California. Gave it to a Canadian guy, and he got arrested at the border or something. He told us later for whatever reason, trying to get back to Canada. Anyway, but yeah, I always liked aviation. I had a plane for a while at Great Western and so on.
So
anyway, I got through all that. I suppose in those days, when you're a young man, you often, my kids, for example, my daughter says, "What am I going to do, Dad?" And I'd say, "Well, darling, probably everybody in this restaurant is sitting here asking the same question.
No matter what their age.
Yeah, exactly. What's the big why? And probably that everybody goes through that. And I was sort of my sister said, "Why don't you get down to Charles Sturt Uni? There's a guy down there called Brian Crozier and Tony Jordan, and they're doing this wine course, and use some of your credits you've got in metallurgy and go down there." And I sort of became a bit born again, and got into this wine course, and which was 1978 or so, and I loved it. It was fantastic. It was so different, and it was such a different environment to university, where you could actually... I remember meeting Tony Jordan for the first time, and sort of berated me for not knowing much about a spectrograph, and showing me how it worked and so on, and put you in at the deep end. It was so very, very different and so enjoyable. And there was a lot of energy there, I suppose, is maybe the best way to put it. A lot of diverse people who decided to take up winemaking, and they're all still around, basically, all still here and there. Some have retired and so on, but I'm still going. And I suppose, in the words of Goss, still maintaining that rage, which Brian Crozier invoked in us all to, do your best.
Can you just tell us a little bit about Brian Crozier? Because I know him, but...
Brian, yeah, well, incredibly... a guy with tremendous mental capacity and a tremendous work ethic, and sort of very, not fixed in his views, but always has a very solid position to take about things. And I worked for him for about 18 months when we built Petaluma in the Adelaide Hills, and it was a very tough start-up, and we built the winery and got through a vintage. But I had to go back and finish my degree. I wanted to do that as much as anything. But I suppose not fanaticism, but simple just work ethic. I think it's the best way to put it, just try harder, do your best. And that's, never give up. And I suppose in terms of winemaking, apply that to if you see you've got some ordinary fruit or something that comes into the winery, you just try your best. You don't let it slide away. You see what you can get out of it. And I suppose that's the thing. I always take the view that when you bring grapes into a winery that, notionally they're either A, B or C grade, and that's life. They're not always the best grapes, but whatever you do inside that box, whatever comes out the other end should represent that split. All you can ever do is try and limit, let's say, entropy, or try and make sure that if it is A grade when it comes in, it comes out as A grade. That's all you can do.
Because it can come out C grade, can't it?
You can't add information. You can't add something that's not there. Information, being in terms of flavour or aromas, but you can certainly take it away. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, which is the winemaker's hand being shown, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, your responsibility starts as soon as that fruit comes off the vine. That's when it kicks in. As soon as those grapes fall into a bin, that's when it kicks off. And from that time onwards, until it gets into the bottle and beyond that, it's your responsibility.
Can I go back just a little bit to the point at Charles Sturt University when you said, you were wandering around America, you were wandering around Australia trying to look, as per your sister's suggestion, to find something to fall in love with. You fell in love with winemaking at Charles Sturt University. What exactly was it in your youth that you went, that's what I want to do? Apart from the people which you've touched on, very engaging people and a very engaging environment, but what exactly was it?
Well, it was such a, I think for me it was such an interesting, working in the sort of physical environment of metallurgy, and then, reading one of the fundamental paper by Watson and Crick, the structure of DNA. I thought, God, I know nothing about this. I came back like a born-again Christian to my parents. They didn't know what was going on, and all this. It was so interesting. It was part of the physical part of the physical universe, biochemistry that I knew nothing about whatsoever. And it was so interesting. And probably that, as an aside, was one of the things that I just found. It was a completely different universe, and I could understand it. That was the great thing about it, and it was so engaging. And that sort of crazy mixture of, I won't say science and art. I mean, that's cliche.
I was just about to say that.
No, we won't go there. But to see the effects of what technology can do or can't do for you when you're making wine. I think that's a hard question. It really is a difficult question.
Well, let me make it even harder. So what you've just identified then back in the 70s, is it the same thing that you're in love with winemaking today, or has it changed? Well, I mean,
I think
what's your journey been in terms of appreciation of your craft?
Well, I think I think as I think the thing is not to put it this way, every vintage I go through, I learn something new. I don't hold anything to be a given. It always keeps you on your toes. I don't want to become a sort of cliche-ridden dinosaur, and I look to see what other people do and see if that's useful, and make use of those techniques or technologies if they're available. But I think it still grabs me in the same way. But I'm always questioning my own performance or my own behaviour during the whole winemaking process, and make sure that I just don't accept or assume anything, really, and just keep to the fundamentals, really. And the fundamentals are fairly straightforward. Taste a lot, basically, and make sure you're ahead of the game, really. Yeah.
Who was the biggest influence on your career? You've mentioned Brian Crozier.
Well, probably not one person, but quite a few, I suppose. Brian Crozier, probably Tony Jordan from a left to centre perspective. Warren Randall, I worked with at Great Western. Ian McKenzie, who was the chief winemaker, who brought a lot of structure to Great Western. We were pretty wild and kept us more or less under control.
Warren Randall, of course, now having a huge impact on the Barossa.
Yeah, he is,
and other regions.
Yeah, we were quite a team. I suppose, there was a group of people, and I suppose probably Ian McKenzie under his leadership in Great Western allowed us to sort of flower a bit, but, kept the whip on as necessary to make sure we didn't get too loose with the truth or too left of field or whatever. It kept us fairly much on the straight and narrow. But lots of other winemakers, you see what they do, and there's you're not the centre of the world. There are a lot of other people that can make some interesting juice, and you look to see what they do and so on and so on. Australia has changed a lot. There are a lot of skilled people out there now. In fact, I suppose in the in the 80s, the thing of the flying winemakers was a big thing. It was sort of a notion whereby Australian winemakers would go overseas and show those Frenchmen what to do and so on and so on. The funny thing was, I think it had more of an impact on the domestic industry in a way, because those people came back with lots of ideas and lots of questions about maybe we could do it this way and see how we come. And I think that's developed in the last 15 years.
Were you actually a flying winemaker?
To some degree, I did some, yeah. Mostly in Italy, but as always, those things, it's always about culture.
Yeah.
And the difficult thing is always to change the culture of the place where you're working, and that in Italy, that's not easy, and in fact, it's not possible. And so, it's like having a wind-up toy. You've got to keep it wound up all the time, otherwise it winds down and things go back to the way they were very quickly.
So what was this initial desire from the Italian winemaking fraternity to bring, literally, to fly in New World Australian winemakers into?
No, well, this wasn't and would never have been at those times invoked by Italians. This was brought about by a called Jacques Laton, who came he actually came to Great Western in 1981, was I first met him, and he said, and I met him later on a few times, and he said, I'll come and do some vintages overseas. So I went over, and it was more about just very basic stuff, and he was he was a flying winemaker himself of the nth degree, and he'd get various people in and so on, just to make sure things were simple and clean and so on and so on. That's all he wanted, and that was a hard job.
And what knowledge or influence did you bring back to bear on your practice in Australia?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Probably in those days, Australians, I think Brian Crozier would have said this as well, that we were very good at making, we were just beginning to take the UK by the throat with Sunshine in a Bottle and so on, remember those?
Oh, yeah.
And it was revolutionary for the Brits to see a varietally labelled Chardonnay on the bottle, and Rosemount were the people that led that chase, and they brought over a bunch of MWs, I think, in the mid-'80s. And I thought we were the kings of the world. And I distinctly remember going to a tech conference where a guy got up and was talking about how wines are made in Burgundy, and he was almost laughed off the stage. I remember that. And he'd been there, and not so much he'd seen the light, he just simply wanted to talk about what the French do, right or wrongly. And we were so, I can't think of the right word, the right adjective, but we were so, maybe up ourselves might be the best way to put it, that we took no heed of it. But some of that wore off. Some good winemakers, they say, always observe, are good at sort of observation, not necessarily being able to explain things, but anecdotal or observational things is always good, and good winemakers do it. And I think those people came back with stuff and said, well, let's try this, let's do this, let's have a look at it. And lo and behold, we have all sorts of things now, and I think things like orange wines are just a bit of a natural extension, but it's all happened before anyway. We all drink cloudy beers now, for example. You go to a boutique, I won't start to opinionate here, but...
Please do.
You go to a brewery, and if the beer's not cloudy, you think there's something wrong. And
too clear.
Well, remember there was an advertising thing called cold filtered.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, that's gone. Yeah.
True.
Yeah, nobody drinks cold filtered beer anymore.
What is your view on the so-called orange movement?
Well, I think the thing is, I think Crozier wrote a good article about that. He said, well, do whatever you want, but don't let me not produce a wine that's full of lovely aromatic compounds that I've protected and got through into the bottle for you from some lovely Chardonnay or whatever. So go your hardest. And I suppose in the marketplace that'll be determined. The market will sort it out.
So do what you want to do, be what you want to be.
Well, people don't obviously do it for fun, and they want to sell the wine. But I think always the danger is that they use it as they use what you might call the mainstream industry as a sort of a negativity about it to promote their own interests. I think that's not good. And I think the industry will respond in its own way. My issue with a lot of those wines is that, I'm looking for fruit flavour, and some of them do show that. Some do, but some simply don't. And I think fruit flavour is, I would have thought, is fairly fundamental in winemaking.
Absolutely, flavour. Absolutely,
flavour.
Yeah.
But you can taste some wines. It's impossible to tell what variety it's made from. You can't pick it. It's impossible. Not that you should be able to pick it, but you can't pick what you might call discernible grape flavour. It could be any variety from anywhere, from any region. It could be Greek or whatever. When I see another story about a Greek orange wine or a Georgian orange wine or this or that, I just say, well, okay, yeah, fine. It's, on one hand, people sprout terroir, but I'm not sure how an orange wine could ever show that.
Interesting.
I don't see how.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to be level-headed about this. I'll go away and have a beer and think differently about it. But, there have been a lot of changes, and that's one of them, and let's see where it takes us. And there might be some sort of hybrid thing that comes out the end of it, which could be really interesting for us.
That could be interesting, yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Where the two parties meet in the middle.
Yes.
You were talking about flavour, and clearly the style of wines you make have a lot of flavour. And there's this terminology which is that some people can pick a winemaker's handshake on a wine, their imprimatur, their imprint. What do you bring to your wines? What do you think the hallmark of Brian Fletcher's winemaking style is?
Oh, well, hopefully balance and flavour and balance. I think they're just fundamental. I think so. And try and, gee, what a hard question. That's just a really difficult one.
Good.
Just go and check my notes out here. Get my secretary to write me up something and email me. I don't have a secretary, but again, I think varietal expression is so important, and balance and flavour, and as much complexity that you can sort of dial into the wine without losing those characters.
Which brings me finally to Margaret River.
Yeah.
So you grew up in Newcastle.
Yeah.
You wander all around America.
Yeah.
You've been all over Italy and Europe and Northern Hemisphere, and you ended up in Margaret to get married and raise a family. Why Margaret? What led you there?
Well, it was the end of the earth, actually. I went there first on a technical conference, I remember, in 1984 with Warren, and I thought it was in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing there. I remember we used to run in those days. I ran out to the beach on Allcliff Road, and I was just stunned how there was nothing, absolutely nothing. But
and not many wineries either at that stage.
No, I remember we went to Cape Mentelle. David was there. The roundabout thing was I worked in Great Western, and after 8 years I decided to, some people said, come down to the Yarra Valley and make wine at St Hubert's, where I made some Pinot Noirs and so on.
Oh, they were the glory days of St Hubert's.
Oh, yeah. And then it sort of fell over. They were...
They were. Those Pinots during the 80s were
they were interesting wines.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was a new experience, and I worked in a very small winery, and so I stayed there 5 years, and then I got the opportunity to go and work for Evans and Tate as their chief winemaker in the West.
Yep.
So
based in Margaret?
No, it was based in those days in the Swan Valley.
Swan Valley.
Yeah. They had a winery there called Nangara.
Yes, I remember.
It was like a sort of pink Rancho Deluxe style of place.
Yeah.
It was Viva Zapata sort of arches and so on, And
that's when the Swan Valley actually was a distinct region as opposed to suburbia, which it now is being gobbled up into Perth, really, hasn't it?
Pretty much. It's quite interesting to see what's happened. in terms of, it's become a sort of a suburban playground of microbreweries and distilleries and so on and so on. So it's changed, its character's changed quite a bit.
Yep.
Anyway, they decided to build a winery in Margaret River, which we built, and I moved to Margaret River because it was simpler and kids went to school there and so on and so on. So the reason why I ended up there or went there was because, we were growing at such a pace, and the issues with, the local environmental laws in the Swan Valley and the encroachment of suburbia and so on really in the end forced us to move to Margaret River, where we found a sort of nice big site with nothing around us whatsoever. And went for it and built this, we called it the Death Star in those days. It was quite a big place, actually. Built that, got it kicked off, and I stayed with that company for 8 years, and then I was very tired, and that's really when I went to Italy in 2000. So from 93 to 2000, I worked in Western Australia.
Yep.
The first 2 or 3 years of that were in the Swan Valley, and then we moved to Margaret River, which was, cooler and just nice. After the Swan in summer, it's not a place that you can enjoy. It's hot.
So you actually that's where your actual living quarters were in Margaret, because you actually live in Perth now, don't you?
Yeah. No, yeah, we lived right in Margaret River.
Yeah, right.
And so on and so on. And the winery was north of Margaret River, near Busselton. Yeah.
An interesting stat, and I think I'm right, but tell me if I'm not. Margaret River produces just 3% of the total Australian grape production.
Yeah.
And yet it produces or is accountable for over 20% of Australia's premium wine market. That pretty much says it all about the region, doesn't it? I mean, it's all upside with Margaret River, isn't it? I mean, it is just a super premium winemaking region, and you landed yourself in the middle of it at the time when it was still defining itself and discovering itself.
Well, when I went there, I said, somebody interviewed me in the paper over there when I first got there, and I said, it's a bit of a cottage industry. And, of course, that fired off a few shots, which it was. It was absolutely a cottage industry. And then put it this way, when I went to the Yarra Valley, there were about 3 trained winemakers, and after 5 years there were 25 or 30 of them, that we had a bit of a show when I left. That was the change in 5 years. And I think Margaret River's gone through the same thing. Training is so important, technical training. Once you've got that, it's like flying a plane. You can enjoy flying rather than, having those rote skills. Yes, it does perform. I mean, you can see, there have been some really good show successes lately over there. For whatever reason, I think people, there's a real sort of craft mentality there with the winemaking, and it's extremely competitive yet cooperative at the same time. It's good. It's interesting.
And it's still a reasonably young
absolutely
industry.
Yes.
Isn't it? Because really, prior to, say, someone like Lewin Estate, it really wasn't pretty much on the map, was it?
No.
Until the 70s. I mean, I grew up just north of there, and Mum and Dad used to take me down there on my school holidays, and it was sheep and cattle.
Yeah. Well, I know a guy that was, with the ag department there in the 70s, and he said it was a poor area, that people, had lived in sort of sheds and so on with Hessian doors and so on and so on. It was a tough place, and it wasn't a particularly good dairy area at all. It was built around soldier settlers, and it's interesting to hear some of the oral histories of it, and you can see by the geography of the place and the way it's been cleared. It was cleared for dairy, which was never that successful. People couldn't make a living out of it.
Really? Okay. Yeah. It's quite a long, narrow region, isn't it?
Yeah.
From top to toe.
It's about 100 clicks long, and it's about 30 wide. Not all of that is vineyard, of course. I mean, that'd be bigger than bloody Bordeaux or something. But there are certain little parts of it that can grow grapes, and it's stretched further south now because it's cooler further south, and there's certainly a demand for that style of Chardonnay, and that's happened.
So you can get different styles of Chardonnay or different...
absolutely.
From the north to the south?
Absolutely. And quite often it depends on, it's sort of 6 of one, half the other. If you have a hot vintage, everybody runs to the south. If it's a cool vintage, everybody runs to the north. And then starts rationalising their decisions. This year, for example, it was very tricky down further south and so on and so on. You know, so you try and spread the risk. That's what all companies do, including me. Spread the risk. It's there's an old saying: putting all your eggs in one basket can be good. You can be a hero, but also you can have issues. Yeah, I mean, if you simply drive from Margaret River and drive 20, 30 minutes south, you can see the nature of the bush. Even the trees start to lean over because of the influence of the Southern Ocean. Yeah, and that has an impact on vines as well. And the soils change, of course, and they change within 100 metres of each other. But from north to south, it's vastly different. Vastly.
And romantically, a lot of wine writers allude to the similarities between Margaret and a very famous wine region in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yep.
Do you think that, usually Bordeaux?
Yeah, sure.
Is that right?
Personally, I don't think it is because, I think the thing is that during the ripening season, it's very similar, but the first and foremost thing I'd say is day length is completely different. You know, the length of day, we live in a completely different latitude to Bordeaux. We're near the ocean, yes. The whole vine management is completely different. The whole culture is completely different, Yep. I mean, you go to Bordeaux and there's a culture there that's been in place for some time. The soils are, well, you could say this shovelful of soil here is similar, but the rest of it isn't. Yeah. So I think often you'll see that with the, people, the English wine press will often see features in, for example, Margaret River Cabernet that do show some of these characters which are sort of, dare I say, Bordeaux-like. The wines have a sort of a structure to them. They're less fruity, less fruit-driven than, say, other styles in Australia. And I can understand why they relate to that because they're quite, they do stand out. Margaret River Cabernets, they stand out. You can see them. And but then you go, so what? Nobody's, I think, striving to do that. But it's almost inevitable. You make a Chardonnay and somebody says it's Burgundian-like. I mean, what do you do? And you say, no, well, I don't know. Is it? You make it, and that's how it is.
Yeah, it's Margaret-like.
Yeah, exactly. So I can hardly see how you can make that comparison. Yeah. Because simply one's on the other side of the planet for a start would be the simple answer, I think.
It just made me realise when you're talking about that, you're alluding to these famous regions overseas that have been going for literally hundreds of years. Yeah. And Margaret has been around since really the mid-70s. Yeah. So 40 years as
Well, I think a lot of people say, they'd say to me, the French have been making wines for hundreds of years and therefore they know what they're doing. Well, really the modern wine industry, I would have thought is only, has been since the advent of, say, Bordeaux mixture and Louis Pasteur understanding what spoiled wines and the role of oxygen and the role of malolactic fermentation. All that technology came to Australia in the late 19th century. So, look, I can remember I had a friend at college. His father was a fellow called John Stanford, who was a wine writer, and you tell him in the story that during the 50s they were going around McLaren Vale showing people how to measure pH in the 50s. And probably would have been exactly the same in Bordeaux, I'm sure of it. Or probably they never measured it. They don't seem to measure it in California either. But anyway, that's another story. I won't stick the pin in there. In the Napa especially, I'm not sure what that's all about. But, the modern winemaking industry has been sort of in parallel with the French. Hundreds of years of history. It's sort of like saying, well, the Romans made wine, therefore they, we should all be making wines in amphoras or eggs or whatever. It's just meaningless.
Which a lot of people are actually doing.
Well, good on them. Go for it. Yeah, I haven't got one yet, but
it's a trend. You haven't gotten a concrete egg yet.
No, not yet.
Yeah, right.
No, I've just looking for some good Ralston Candos Portland cement, and I'll make one actually.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So just on that,
yeah.
Do you see the attributes of why people do use these current on-trend things such as a concrete concrete egg, which for those who are watching or listening literally is the shape of an egg made out of concrete, about 2 inches thick and standing the height of a tall man. Right? So why are they suddenly the rage?
Well, I think you obviously get different characteristics in them. There's no question about that. You can see it. I made a lot of wine in Italy in concrete tanks. They were lined concrete tanks, thousands and thousands and thousands of hectolitres of the stuff, which we ended up bulldozing, a lot of them. I don't know, you can read... it's a tricky one, I suppose. They have certain characteristics of oxygen ingress, and they have maybe a particular flavour they might impart to the wine, and so on and so on. I'm not sure about the shape. I think that's probably more an issue about strength and manufacturing, I would have thought. Yeah, right. Egg-shaped is strong, rather than any other thing. You can read a lot of stuff, and the articles about egg-shaped fermenters become almost a parody of themselves, really. You can read so much, but trying to get to the bottom of it, I can't say more. If it's worth trying, let's try it. That's all I can say.
So you're open to these new things?
Of course, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I've tasted a few wines. I really can't, say much about it. I wouldn't like to build a winery of concrete eggs. Put it that way. I wouldn't be keen on doing something like that. But stainless steel has worked well for us.
Yeah, absolutely,
absolutely, very well indeed.
Can I quote you this quote?
Yeah.
It says, because I'm going to.
Wait a minute. Switch off now.
It says, although Brian is a household name in Margaret River and a veteran winemaker for the region, veteran in the nicest possible term.
Sure.
He is somewhat of a quiet achiever and prefers to stay out of the limelight and right back in the vineyard with his beloved wines, quote unquote, which resonates with me because I've been... I know you well over the years, and I've been doing a lot of diving and digging to find information on you, and it is scant. It is tough to find.
Really?
Now,
I'll send you a brochure, Stuart.
Yes, I want to know, why are you so humble after this long career? Why do you like to stay out of the limelight?
Well, as they say... humble in victory, gracious in defeat. I was at the Settlers one night there, and there were some boys there from...
which is the famous tavern in Margaret River, by the way.
There was some I think they were pruners. They were from Tonga or somewhere, and there were some Irish lads. And there was a union match on. It wasn't going so well for the Ireland, and there was a bit of heat. And I said to this bloke, humble in victory, mate, because it was starting to get, I think even...
a bit close.
The security boys were starting to, just starting to pull in a bit of oxygen, because I thought it was going to get going, but it didn't. But anyway, I think, look, you can... making wine is a profession. You try and do your best. If it comes off, great. You always try and do your best. That's all there is to it. I'm not a celebrity chef, which, if you take a species of people, they're good self-promoters. Amazing, actually. Winemaking is a profession, so... And probably a few knocks occasionally when things go wrong, as I wrote about a couple of weeks ago. Things can go wrong.
Yeah.
It's always on the back of your mind. You try and cover every base.
And that blog post was widely read, by the way, because people are fascinated by that sort of thing. Because they only see the stuff that goes right. They don't hear about the stuff that goes wrong.
No. I have a long list of excuses I can pull up if I need to.
I love reading that when you said, listen, make sure you've got an excuse so you can blame something or someone else. I mean,
exactly.
Brilliant.
Yes, exactly. Anyway.
So, which leads me to this other leading question, which is... Yeah. I mean, you've sort of, ever since the 70s, going through Charles Sturt University, through the Northern Hemisphere, through Italy and Europe, and finally back to Margs, you've had an extraordinarily long, successful career by any definition. Can you pinpoint what actually has led to that success over such a long period of vintages?
Well, one would be luck. There's no question. I was lucky.
Which bit was lucky?
probably the lucky bit was my sister turning up one day when I was, doing this, and I saw a strange car there, and it was my sister, because you start to be aware of those things. I said, "Who's that down there?" She said, "Why don't you get a life, and go down to Chalstert and have a go at this?" And
was she an older sister, by the way?
Yeah. And I thought, what a good idea. Yeah, it's really interesting, and it really interested me and tied me up, and I, got through all those things that I'd been through as a young man and so on, and probably that was luck, just sheer luck, really, and just meeting various people on the way, or people that met me, I suppose. They were lucky.
I mean, those moments, like for instance, the fact that you remember that conversation with your sister back in your 20s.
Yeah.
What a powerful moment that you actually still remember it and know that it was actually a pivot point or a tipping point in your life.
Yeah.
The power of family, I guess, or the power of someone.
Well, I remember driving off, and the boys said, "Study, Fletch," and I had my Ford Escort RS 2000. I drove down to Wagga and got into it, just lived the life and got into being a student again. And the people were so interesting, and there was such a, when you're in your early 20s, life is really bright, you see things really, it's with a lot of clarity, or you think you do, and it was a good time. And so I was lucky to have that, lucky to fall in with the right people, lucky to get, a chance, and work very hard, and, had a few low moments, but got through all those and so on, and wiggled my way through different career changes. And finally, I suppose one of the points you asked me about life-changing things or pivotal events was after 8 years at Evans and Tate, my wife said, "Let's get out." And there was a job in the paper, chief winemaker, Southern Italy, with B.R.L. Hardy. And she said, and that's when I met Maurizio. And we went in cold into Sicily, like no checking out the house, no checking out the schools, no nothing. Just flew over there and landed. And the next day, I think I flew off to Tunisia with Maurizio, and my wife was in a house in Sicily, in a village, she was pretty strong and got through that. And
so this was a 5-year period?
Yeah.
What was that like generally?
That was a ride.
Was it?
Yeah. Maurizio, he passed away actually, but Maurizio was probably the black sheep of the Michike family. He was a doctor, and he really burnt the candle. He just really burnt it. And he had such huge plans, and he was a passionate, romantic Italian in every sense, we'll put it that way. And I worked with another guy there, Shane, and Shane was quite an eclectic viticulturist Australian, and he said, "Oh, this is like reading a Graham Greene novel, because every month there'd be a new project." We did a project in Malta. I went down to Malta quite a bit. We started doing a project in Turkey. Then we had a winery set up in Tunisia, which I went down there for the next 5 years. I was down there every fortnight or so. And, then there was going to be one in Georgia, as I said, not the KFC Georgia, the other Georgia. And I said no. I said, I don't want to get tied up with the Russian 15th Guards Armoured Division or something, I said, I'm not going. And so I stayed there. It was a hell of a ride. It was just bizarre, it was just crazy. And Maurizio just had such huge plans. And he actually almost did it. He set up a joint venture with Hardy UK. He had a brand called Distinto. But I suppose in the end he promised the earth but couldn't deliver. That's why I got there, to try and help sort it. And it's like all joint ventures, unless somebody's really, that wasn't the end. That for Maurizio, I think it was the end in itself, to have this joint venture. But there was nobody to really drive it, to keep it going, make it work. It was a big brand. And it was very clever what he did, very clever. And he was way ahead of his time in marketing, but he wasn't an operator, but he was good at, what he did. He was a clever man, very clever.
What brought you back to Australia?
Oh, look, my wife left after 3 years because of issues with education, as always, you know. I mean, in the village, they had where Willie went, there was a copying machine which was broken. There was no money to repair it and so on, you know. And the learning was very rote and so on, but that's fine, you know. Who else can design a Ferrari, you know, in the symbol of the free world, isn't it, you know? Or Italian design is fantastic. So she went home and I commuted backwards and forwards quite a bit. And in the end, everybody lost the passion, I think. Everybody lost the passion because I had to sort of play a bit of the sort of cold-hearted Anglo-Saxon and try and keep things in the winemaking sense on the straight and narrow, not too many brands, because Italians will invent labels till the cows come home, just extend brand extension forever.
Yep.
And without selling any more wine.
Yeah, interesting. What's the point?
Exactly.
What's the point?
And I had to keep that under control, and everybody lost interest, and you know, I said, I think I've got to go home, Maurizio. He was cool, he was good, and I met him a couple of years later. I actually met him about 3 years ago in Tunis. Actually, I went down to Tunis and caught up with him. He was exactly the same, spinning it for all he was worth. Yeah,
great marketing.
Yeah,
that's what great marketers can do.
Yep.
Sometimes. I just want to take us to the point in 2012 when you actually joined, or as we like to say here at Naked, we liberated the creativity of Brian Fletcher.
Oh.
You actually have a quote here from that back then. The spark of creativity has had some serious fuel poured on it since I've been involved with Naked Wines. Elaborate.
Well, Naked was the vehicle, as a Texas cop would say. I think the attraction of Naked for people that like Naked Wines is you try and deliver something that's authentic. I think that's the key, you know. I've made a couple of wines there when I first got going, and I thought, well, I had a feeling they would not quite work, and they didn't quite work, you know. But since then, I've tried to deliver authenticity into the label.
Yep.
And it was such an incredibly clever idea, I thought. You know, I remember going to the opening here in Potts Point, and everybody was there, and I said, God almighty, this is amazing. You know, I was blinded by the number of flashes from the iPhones and iPads and so on. I'd never seen anything like that before, you know. In Seppelts, when I was there, we were lucky to have a PR lady who took it on board to promote the winemakers, young guns or Turks or whatever you want to call it. And we thought we were kings of the world. But up until that time, Seppelts, it was like ABC, the ABC. There were no personalities, none. That's the way winemaking was. And then there were things like Burge and Wilson came along and all that sort of stuff. So the winemaking became personalised with this well, not a cult, but a culture of the wine, the person. And the almost revolutionary thing that I've seen in Naked is this ability of people to come and talk to you through the medium of social media, but through social media, or it's absolutely striking when they come up to you when we go to these events. It's absolutely striking that people say, "Oh, hello, Brian, how you going? How's your dog doing?" or something like that. You know, but you know that's not quite a truth, but they love engaging with you because it's really, in the end, as I said about working in Italy, it wasn't about technology, it was about culture, you know, empathising with the issues that people had in the village of getting to work. And some of them, you know, couldn't read, actually, a phonetic language like Italian, you know, all these things. And so, but Naked was such an incredibly clever idea, so clever. We
like to think here at Naked that we literally put you in touch with a wine lover and then get the hell out of the way to actually allow you to have a relationship and a conversation.
You know, I think it's like a Carla Knott in a Le Carré novel. It's a very clever twist. You know, it's clever.
Well, I just found it amazing when I spoke to you before we actually started this chat, and I said, you know, have you done one of these before? And you said no. I mean, that's just phenomenal.
Yeah.
This is, you know, the first time that a true conversation with Brian Fletcher will ever hit the airwaves. I mean, After 30
I had a lot of things to say
years.
on the ferry when I came over, but I've forgotten them all, actually.
It's been a great chat.
Yeah.
Let's crack one of your wine, shall we?
Sure.
Let's have a drink. Which one?
18.
Okay. Sam Sauv Blanc?
Yeah.
Classic Margaret River blend, yeah. So this is the Brian Fletcher Estate, Semillon Sauvignon Blanc, 2018 from Margaret River. Just tell us about this wine, Brian.
There I was.
In 2018.
The cold steel of the tank against my back, exactly. Yeah, right. Well, it's really a wine that Western Australia does really well. You know, this is just a lovely example of what you might call that really attractive sort of stinging nettle, almost. You might call it. There's a bit of funk there. That's the interesting thing. Probably 20 years ago, I would have probably got stuck into this wine and said, well, you know, it's a bit funky. We need to clean it up. But these days, it's entirely acceptable because it gives interest. It gives...
Great texture.
Yeah, it gives interest and difference to the wine.
It's a beauty.
That's not bad.
Well, we talked about flavour a lot, and that's got oodles of flavour, hasn't it?
That's what it's got to have, my friend.
It's great.
Nice colour. I suppose the other pivotal thing in winemaking would be screw caps. If I was going to name one technological innovation which has really changed the world for winemaking has been that amazing difference. Okay.
Do you want to crack that?
Why not?
Sure.
So we've got a WA Merlot.
Thank you. And this is 2018.
Good year, Margaret River. Nice colour.
Yeah, it's bright.
Oh, that's good, I must say. I think what we've tried to do is, there's some really good winemakers around the place that make these really sort of nice, fleshy, fresh wines. I think we've tried to do that with the Merlot.
Good berry fruit drive to it.
Yep, exactly. People seem to like freshness. I'm not talking about youth so much, but freshness. That's what we've tried to put in the bottle. And again, there's nice balance. It's not mawkish. I use that word a lot. I don't know if it's actually a real English word, but mawkish means, too soft and without any sort of drive, bland, like a boot full of custard or something rather. But this has got some nice drive to it, and nice fleshy, nice berry fruit.
And we talk about length and finish, and those flavours are just, as you're talking there, I'm just going, they go on and on and on.
Yes.
Finally, what's this one we're trying?
This is a Tempranillo. We've called it El Cid. There's
Why did you call it El Cid?
Because people... it's a great question. I don't know, but I think it sounds vaguely Spanish, I'd imagine, without being facetious.
Yes.
Stuart, no. Why not? It's like Mano Rosso, eh? So this is a Tempranillo. This is a different kettle of fish completely. This is spicy, lifted, rich Tempranillo. It's hard sometimes to define a variety or varietal characters with Tempranillo. Yeah.
It's generous, isn't it?
Generous. And this is more of a wine that you you might have with a bit of lamb or something, It's got some nice, just enough tannin and so on to drive it along, and just...
It is a little bit grippy, isn't it, in a nice way, but it's almost commanding food to go
I think
with it.
Maybe I'm getting to a point where, like in network, I don't care anymore, but not really. I like to see some flavour and see some tannin, There's
I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore.
I'm not going to take it anymore.
Yeah.
I like to see some tannin. There's nothing wrong with tannin. It's not bitter. It's not hard. It's just tannin, Nobody would ever accuse Penfolds of having too much tannin.
Absolutely.
It's like Roy and HG, too much is never enough. Is that what they said?
Yes, it is.
Right. So,
I think from memory, yes.
yes. So
that's a big red, isn't it? That commands respect.
Yeah. Plus it's got flavour.
Oh, yeah.
So we've gone back to the fundamentals, flavour, balance, persistence. And I think with a bit of funk in there as well, a bit of other things going on, a bit of complexity, and that's what else can I say?
Yeah.
I think that's what does it.
That'll go for years.
It will.
You mentioned flavour, and you mentioned that we talked about flavour. We've almost come full circle. I mean, I can honestly say I could go on talking with you, Fletch, for another hour. You've got so many wonderful stories and such wonderful insight into the actual winemaking fraternity and business. But we do have to wrap it up, and so
that's a wrap.
That's not so much a wrap yet, but it soon will be, because as I always do, I finish with 5 questions in 5 seconds, which, as I always say, never takes 5 seconds. It can take as long as you want. What's your favourite wine?
Probably the greatest wine I've ever drunk would be a J.J. Prum Auslese from probably the early 70s, I think. Some German wines I find are just stunningly good. My background was really in white winemaking, and you appreciate just how lucky they are to have that sort of ability to make those sort of wines, which have just stunning levels of aromaticity and flavour and so on. They're probably my favourite ones. I don't get to drink them that much, but or maybe, if you want to go top level, maybe Le Montrachet or something like that from the late 70s. Maybe, as a brand, you have to admire Penfolds. What a brand can place every wine at a price point. Just successfully, amazing. And so I admire them for their, like that scene in Alien. I admire it for its purity. I mean, I admire them for their ability to do that. But probably German wines. Let's narrow that down. Some of the great Auschleses are just stunningly good. Absolutely, that's my particular thing. Okay. Yep.
What's your favourite wine moment thus far? Anywhere, anytime.
Anywhere, anytime. Goodness me. Probably getting a degree, actually, of all things, and it was good for me to get it, and it changed my life from there. And I had a good solid piece of paper, and that probably what got me going. You can say as I stood up and got a trophy or something, but okay, that's fine. But getting that first step to me was a big thing. For me personally,
taking that first step.
Yeah.
Your favourite driving song?
Well, Jesus, it's probably something from the Moody Blues. I don't know. Going back, well, actually, I listen to ABC regional when I'm driving, or Richard Sidler or something like that.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many people listen to that. All the boys, even the Viddy boys, say, "Oh, I was listening to ABC, Brian," like that. I'm not musical. I have to say I'm not very musical, Stuart. So.
Mate, that's great. It's a great plug for the ABC regional channels.
I used to live next to people, and I used to have to record the song or try and hum it, and the girl next door to us, she was fantastic. She could name every song. She was amazing.
Well, that's a skill.
Yeah.
What do you want to be doing in 5 years' time?
Well, the plan is to be somewhere. We'll put it this way, when I went to Italy, my wife said we have to have a crunchy gravel driveway, in a pink stucco sort of place. We got a cement driveway, so probably maybe spending some time in Sicily, in Catania, somewhere down there. That's a good place to be, near the markets, eat fish. Yeah, beautiful. Do that. And you can get out of there easily is the second thing. It's got a good airport.
Do you speak the language?
Enough.
Enough to get by?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
The best thing about making wine for Naked Angel customers? We've touched on it, but...
it's the people.
You can say it again.
It's the contact, There's nothing wrong with a bit of self-esteem and
respect.
Nothing wrong with people saying, you've made a lovely wine, thank you, I enjoy it. What else is there, really, in the end? There's nothing else, really. And that's it's such a pleasure to try and make a good wine for people. If you don't have that inside you, then you're probably in the wrong game, I would have thought,
Brian, on that note, I'm going to say thank you for coming all this way from Margaret River to our HQ in Manly.
Sure.
And taking the time to actually make brilliant wine for us. I want to thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I'd like to stay here, Stuart, because the environment here is an absolute pleasure as well.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Drink Naked. Hopefully you enjoyed the podcast. If you like what you heard, leave a 5-star review. And if you think you know someone that might like it as much as you, please let them know that we exist. In the meantime, stay tuned for the next winemaker rockstar to come visiting at Naked HQ.